All right, so we're diving into the life and times of Jimmy Carter today
Mhm.
and, getting ready to go beyond just like the peanut farmer thing and the solar panels at the White House. We're going to uncover a man with some surprises, triumphs, controversies, even a few secrets along the way. You ready for this?
Absolutely. I think, what makes Carter so fascinating is how he just defies any simple label you try to put on him. He was deeply religious, but he was also a very sharp political operator, especially on the world stage. And that post-presidency work, I mean, that's just groundbreaking stuff.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back. Like imagine just going from running a peanut farm in rural Georgia straight to leading the free world. That's got to be a big leap.
It is. And, his roots in Plains, Georgia are really key to understanding him. Growing up in the Great Depression, it kind of instilled this like really strong work ethic in him, a connection to the land, a sense of community, things like that. And that never left him. And those same values, they really resonated later when he positioned himself as that outsider candidate, the guy not from Washington.
So not your typical like climb up the political ladder.
Exactly. He wasn't a career politician at all. He served in the Navy, even had this crazy experience helping contain a nuclear reactor meltdown up in Canada.
Wait, hold on. We're definitely circling back to that one. That sounds
Oh,
intense.
it is a story. And then he went back to Georgia, got into local politics, state senate, even became governor for a bit.
So it's peanuts to nuclear reactors to governor. Sounds like he was collecting experiences for like the ultimate job interview.
Huh. Yeah, in a way.
But how do you go from being governor of Georgia all the way to the Oval Office?
Well, the 1976 election, it was kind of like a perfect storm. America was just reeling from Watergate. Nobody trusted the establishment. And then you have Carter, the peanut farmer, with this message of honesty. It really tapped into the national mood at the time. He was promising this fresh start, a return to simpler values. And it worked.
Okay, so he wins, becomes president. What are some of those like defining moments of his presidency? The
Yeah.
things people really remember him for?
I mean, you can't talk about Carter without talking about the Camp David Accords. He brought together the leaders of Egypt and Israel, two countries who had been at each other's throats for decades, and somehow brokered a peace treaty, a landmark achievement, And ultimately, it earned him the Nobel Peace Prize years later.
Wow, just imagine being in that room. The tension, the weight of history. It's almost unbelievable he pulled it off.
It really is. It wasn't just negotiation skills, though. Carter brought this, like, moral authority to the table, this
Yeah.
genuine belief in peace. He wasn't afraid to take risks, to push for what he thought was right, even when pretty much everyone doubted him.
He also seemed way ahead of the curve when it came to energy and the environment. Wasn't he the guy who put solar panels on the White House roof?
He was. And it wasn't just for show. Carter was really concerned about the planet, about how reliant we were on fossil fuels. He saw renewable energy as the only way forward, setting an example, even though it seemed kind of radical back then.
Yeah, it's amazing how what seems like common sense now was considered pretty out there back then.
He was ahead of his time, but he was also pragmatic. I mean, he understood we couldn't just flip a switch and go 100% renewable overnight. He pushed for energy conservation, invested in research, and tried to find that balance between economic growth and protecting the environment, which is a challenge even today.
So we've got the peacemaker, the environmental visionary, but every presidency has its challenges, right? What were some of the big hurdles Carter faced?
Well, the Iran hostage crisis is the big one. It was a deeply traumatic event for the entire country, and it had a devastating impact on his presidency.
Oh yeah, 52 Americans held captive for over a year. Just thinking about the pressure he must have been under.
It was constant. Every single day, the crisis was in the headlines. And the nation, they looked to him for answers, for a solution. There were diplomatic efforts, covert operations, even a daring rescue attempt that went horribly wrong. It exposed the limits of American power, and a lot of people felt he had been outmaneuvered.
I can't imagine how that must have felt, like almost a personal failure.
I'm sure it weighed on him heavily. It's a big part of why he lost the 1980 election, too. But context is important here. This was a time of global upheaval. The Cold War was raging. The Middle East was a tinderbox.
And then there was the economy. I remember learning about stagflation in school. Wasn't that a huge issue back then?
It was. Stagflation is this weird situation where you have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. And it's super hard to fix because the things you do to fix one often make the other one worse. It's a tough thing to try to explain to everyday folks who are struggling to just, make ends meet.
So what did Carter do about it?
Well, he tried a bunch of different things with varying degrees of success. He focused on reducing government spending, deregulating certain industries, trying to boost productivity, but the economy was really slow to respond.
So it sounds like he was facing some really intense challenges.
He was, and to be honest, he didn't always handle them perfectly. He was criticized a lot for being too idealistic, too focused on human rights, not tough enough on adversaries.
But you still get this sense that he was incredibly intelligent, principled, a genuinely decent person who was trying to do what he thought was best for the country.
Oh, absolutely. And that leads us to maybe one of the most intriguing parts of Carter's life. All the whispers, the secrets, the behind-the-scenes stuff that makes you wonder, like, what else don't we know?
Okay, yeah, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the mysterious side of Jimmy Carter. UFOs, secret tapes, Cold War intrigue. What do we got?
Well, maybe not full-on espionage, but there were these back-channel communications that he had with the Soviet Union that raised some eyebrows at the time. You know, these unofficial, confidential talks, they're actually pretty common in diplomacy. It's a way to explore sensitive issues without all the public scrutiny.
Wait a minute. Secret talks with the Soviets. During the Cold War, what was going on there?
Well, you gotta remember, tensions were incredibly high back then. But while Carter was a strong advocate for human rights, he also knew that dialogue was essential, especially if you wanted to reduce the risk of, like, full-blown nuclear war.
So even while taking a tough stance publicly, he was trying to keep those lines of communication open behind the scenes.
Exactly. His administration was engaged in this quiet diplomacy, trying to establish direct contact with the Kremlin, explore areas where they could potentially cooperate, maybe even, de-escalate the whole arms race a little.
That's pretty bold considering the political climate. I mean, wasn't it risky?
Yeah, very risky. But Carter never really backed down from doing what he thought was right, even if it meant going against the grain. And this was all happening totally under the radar, away from the media, congressional scrutiny, all of that.
It really does make you wonder what else went on that we just, like, don't know about. Okay, but let's talk about those UFOs for a second. A president reporting a UFO sighting. That's got to be a first.
It definitely grabbed people's attention, and his story is pretty interesting. So back in 1969, before he was president, when he was still governor of Georgia, he claims he saw this strange object in the sky. He described it as really bright, changing colors and moving erratically.
So did he think it was aliens? Come on, did he?
He never actually said that. He attributed it to some kind of weird atmospheric phenomenon. But even years later, he insisted that he saw something unusual, something that he couldn't explain. It just goes to show that even someone as grounded as Carter can have experiences that kind of, defy easy explanation.
And then there are those rumors about the Georgia tapes. What's the truth about those?
Yeah.
Are they real?
The Georgia tapes are a bit of a mystery, honestly. The rumors say that there are these recordings from his gubernatorial campaign, tapes that supposedly have, like, controversial remarks on them or something that could be damaging. Can you imagine if something like that came out in today's political climate?
Yeah, like a total political smoking gun.
Exactly. But here's the thing. No one has ever actually produced these tapes. There's no real evidence they exist at all. It's totally possible that they're just a myth, a political rumor that's gotten blown way out of proportion.
But even the possibility is intriguing, right? Adds to the whole mystery.
It totally does. And that's what makes Jimmy Carter such a captivating figure to study. He was a man full of contradictions, this complex mix of idealism and pragmatism, faith and reason. A politician who defied every label people tried to slap on him, a president who faced impossible challenges, and a man whose life was full of both remarkable achievements and these lingering mysteries.
It's like we're putting together this giant puzzle, trying to get a clearer picture of who he really was.
And we haven't even touched on his experience with that nuclear meltdown or the incredible work he did after leaving office. There's still so much more to uncover.
Well, good thing we've got more time. Stay tuned, because when we come back, we're going to explore those lesser-known aspects of Carter's life and try to figure out what lasting impact he had on the world.
All right, so let's go back to that nuclear reactor incident we talked about earlier. It's not your everyday story, especially not one that involves a future president, right?
It's crazy. A future president dealing with a nuclear meltdown. Okay, tell me everything. What happened?
So it's 1952. Lieutenant Jimmy Carter, trained as a nuclear engineer, is stationed up in Canada. All of a sudden, there's this reactor at Chalk River, Ontario, that experiences a partial meltdown. It could have been a total disaster.
Wow, that must have been terrifying. What did Carter do?
Carter, he volunteered to go right into the reactor building with his team. And this building is highly radioactive. but they had to work quickly and carefully to contain the damage, prevent it from turning into a full-blown catastrophe.
I can't even imagine the courage that must have taken facing that kind of danger. Knowing the stakes are so high, did they manage to pull it off?
They did, thankfully. Carter and his team were able to stabilize the reactor, and they averted a major disaster. It really is a testament to their skill, their bravery, and their willingness to put themselves at risk like that.
It makes you think, this is a guy who looked a nuclear meltdown in the face and then dedicated his life to peace and diplomacy. It's like, I don't know, a superhero origin story or something.
Right, it is, and that's just one part of his story. We can't forget everything he accomplished after he left the White House. His post-presidency is considered one of the most active, impactful ones ever.
Oh yeah, the Carter Center. It's way more than just a think tank, though. They're actually out there doing some really important work in the world.
Oh, absolutely. The Carter Center, he founded it with his wife, Rosalind Carter, back in 1982. It's been a force for good on a global scale. They work so hard to promote democracy, human rights, and peace in all sorts of conflict zones around the world.
What are some of the things they've accomplished? Like, what are their big wins?
They've played a really key role in monitoring elections, ensuring they are fair and transparent, especially in countries that are new to democracy.
I bet that's incredibly complex.
It is. Just imagine trying to observe elections in all these different countries with different systems and making sure it's all done honestly. It's a huge task.
It sounds like it.
They also mediate conflicts, bring warring parties to the table to try and find peaceful resolutions. But it's not as simple as just, sitting and talking. It's about building trust, getting to the root causes of the conflict, and finding ways to solve those problems.
So they're not just slapping Band-Aids on things, they're really trying to get to the heart of the issue.
Exactly. And they've made incredible strides in global health, too, especially in fighting diseases that have been around forever. Things like guinea worm disease, river blindness, and trachoma.
And they've had a big impact, right?
They've been instrumental in moving towards eradicating those diseases.
Eradication. Wow. To think they've literally helped wipe out some diseases.
It's a remarkable accomplishment, and they've done it through a combination of public health initiatives, education, working directly with communities to give them the tools they need to take charge of their own health and well-being.
That's incredible. I mean, he could have just retired to a quiet life after being president. But instead, he chose to keep on serving, dedicating himself to making the world a better place.
And he wasn't afraid to stir things up a bit either. He's been really vocal in his criticism of certain U.S. foreign policies, calling out injustices, speaking truth to power, even when it wasn't popular.
He was never afraid to step on some toes, I'll give him that.
Yeah.
Always stood by his principles, no matter how tough it got.
That's Jimmy Carter in a nutshell, really. A man of deep convictions,
Doesn't mind.
unwavering in his commitment to peace, to justice, to human dignity.
It's hard to sum up a life like his. I mean, he's been called a peacemaker, a humanitarian, a visionary, even a maverick.
And of course, he has been criticized. Some people think he was too idealistic, too naive when it came to the realities of global politics. Others said he was too quick to criticize his own country on the world stage.
But even people who disagree with him, they can't deny that he was sincere. He had this genuine desire to make things better. It's clear he was driven by this really strong moral compass.
For sure. And at the end of the day, I think that's what matters most. His life is a powerful example of how much one person can do to have a positive impact on the world. He might not have been a perfect president, but he was a good man, a man who lived his values, and ultimately a man who left the world a better place than he found it.
So where does that leave us? We've gone from his childhood on a peanut farm to the Oval Office to nuclear meltdowns, Nobel Peace Prizes, secrets, mysteries. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And it's a good reminder that even the biggest public figures, even presidents, they're all just complex people with their own unique stories, their own reasons for doing things, their own flaws.
And we have to look past just the headlines, dig a little deeper to try and understand what shaped them and the legacy they leave behind.
I agree. And when it comes to Jimmy Carter, that legacy is all about service, compassion, and this unwavering belief in the power of peace.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From peanut farms to the Oval Office to nuclear meltdowns to Nobel Peace Prizes. What a journey.
It really has been. It's amazing how your perceptions can change when you really delve into a topic like this. So I'm curious, before we started this whole deep dive, what was your initial impression of Jimmy Carter?
To be honest, I mostly thought of him as that, one-term president, the guy who had to deal with the Iran hostage crisis, the one with the solar panels. It's easy to get stuck on those simple stories.
Yeah, totally. But like we've been talking about, there's just so much more to him than that. When you really dig in, you see how much depth there is to Jimmy Carter.
He really was this like complex, multi-layered person. It's hard to put him in a box. He was a man of faith, but also a pragmatist, a scientist, a negotiator, a humanitarian on a global scale.
It's that mix, that makes him so interesting. He didn't fit the mold of what we thought a president was supposed to be, what a politician was supposed to be like.
He was the ultimate outsider,
Mm.
a peanut farmer who just, talked straight and honestly. And he wasn't afraid to go against the grain, even when it meant making decisions that weren't popular.
Yeah, and his courage is something else. I mean, think about it, from facing that nuclear meltdown as a young guy in the Navy to taking a stand on human rights on the world stage. Carter never backed down from a challenge.
And through it all, he had this incredible humility. You know,
Ah.
he was willing to admit when he messed up, learn from it, and just keep trying to make a difference. You just don't see that a lot in politics.
No, not very often. And that's what makes his work after leaving office so impressive. He could have just walked away from it all, but instead he chose to double down on his commitment to service, to peace, to making the world better.
And he did it all with this quiet determination,
Hmm.
like this unshakable belief in the power of good. It's
Mm.
honestly inspiring.
It is. So going back to that question we asked earlier, was Jimmy Carter ahead of his time, or was he just out of sync with the way things worked in politics?
What do you think?
I think it's probably a bit of both. He was definitely ahead of the curve when it came to stuff like renewable energy and climate change and understanding how important human rights are in foreign policy. But at the same time, he was working within this political system that wasn't always ready to hear his message. He was an idealist in a world that often rewards being cynical.
Maybe that's why his time as president was so tough. It was like he was pushing for progress. But the people who wanted things to stay the same, they were just too powerful.
That's possible, but I also think that we're still figuring out what his legacy is going to be. His ideas, his values, they still have this power to connect with people, to inspire people.
His example of service, of compassion, of
Mhm.
standing up for what's right, those are things we can all learn from no matter what our political beliefs are.
Absolutely. Jimmy Carter's life shows us that any one of us can make a difference. And even when things get tough, it's important to hold on to hope, to keep working towards a better world.
Well said. This has been quite a journey, exploring the life and legacy of this really remarkable man.
He's a fascinating guy, that's for sure.
If anyone out there wants to learn more about Jimmy Carter, his presidency, and all the amazing work he did after leaving office, I highly recommend checking out the Carter Center's website. They have tons of information, pictures, videos, personal stories about how he's impacted the world.
It's a great resource for anyone who's curious to learn more about him.
And a huge thank you to you for joining me today and sharing your insights. I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter. We hope you've come away with a better understanding of this complicated and inspiring man. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.